I love the smell of books.
And Virginia and Rice.
Me too, Laura.
There you go.
It smells like libraries, which smell like...
Okay, let's start in 1763. What's the event that happened? We had a lot of different issues going on, right? As far as different battles, different wars. We had the King Philip's War, the Fought War. The French and Indian War takes place, and that's the French and Indians versus the British. Couple key, well, what's the thing that kind of the key aspect that comes out of that battle?
Out of which one?
Separation or independence.
Well, French. Well, something else. The British. What are the British going through during that time?
A revolution. Wait, during what?
French and Indian War. What's going on in Britain at that time in terms of their finances?
They're very poor.
Very poor. So the thing is, they're tired of America, or like the colonists basically kind of leeching off them and basically using their defense and stuff. So they decided at that point that they wanted to go ahead and use some taxation. What was another issue that came up in 1763? Well, let me ask you this. There was kind of an ugly incident that took place with the Ottawa chief in the Great Lakes area. Basically massacred a lot of the kind of little villages in the kind of the west. Who was that chief? The chief was Pontiac.
Pontiac's War.
Pontiac's rebellion.
No, rebellion, sorry.
So anyway, Pontiac had a rebellion, and all of a sudden the British people are kind of freaking out going, we have to pay all this money to protect the people out in the west. And they started to realize this is going to be really expensive. So they came up with another proclamation, or Pontiac's rebellion. They had a proclamation that really angered the colonists, basically kind of limited their movement. What was that called?
Oh, Appalachian National?
Yep. Proclamation of 1763, and basically it stated that the colonists were not supposed to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the thing about that, did they follow it very closely? No. And it kind of continued, you got to keep in mind too, kind of continued this whole mindset that the colonists had, like we don't have to follow their rules because they're so far away. There are a few early, we'll talk more about that later, but there are a few early attempts they had to kind of crack down a little bit on the colonists prior to the colonial time. What were some of those? Remember any of those? They had some acts they tried to pass for a while. It's basically to try to be more strict with the colonists. They said they were going to do something, but they said they were going to try to be more strict. Remember like the Navigation Acts? Or at least heard of that maybe? It was like back in the I don't know exactly, like 1664, kind of in that area. There was another time, I think in 1686, the Dominion of the New England. Remember that? They kind of came in, they're going to play kind of hardball with the colonists. And there's a guy by the name of Sir Edmund Andros, and he was kind of ruling things with an iron fist. And then something happened in 1688, and basically he was out of power. Something very glorious.
Glorious Revolution?
Glorious Revolution, yes. William and Mary take over, and then basically they kicked, and basically at that point Edmund Andros left the country. So anyway, the point is there were earlier attempts to go ahead and try to crack down on the colonists. So for the colonists, they're sort of going, are you really going to follow through this time? And what was a term that they used? There's a kind of a good term you should know that kind of dealt with the whole idea of the fact that the colonists weren't watched very carefully, that after a while they just kind of ignored the different rules that are out there. They felt a little bit neglected, you could say.
Is that the word we're supposed to remember?
That's the second part. Salutary neglect.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? And that's kind of the term, kind of the all-encompassing like umbrella term for basically what's going on, that they're not paying attention. So anyway, that takes us up to the time after the French and Indian War. So anyway, it's costing them a lot of money. They realized they still had to kind of keep a presence over in the New World and the colonists, and they start to do some different taxation. What were some of the early taxes? What was really the first tax that the Sugar Act, or Act it was called, but it was basically a tax on sugar, obviously. And things just get kind of real tense between the different groups. 1765, another probably a little more major tax is passed. What was that called? What's that? Stamp Act, right. And what was the reaction from the colonists to this?
They didn't like like it.
They didn't like it, and they actually formed the Stamp Act Congress
Oh, yeah.
that started meeting. And it kind of started this sense of rebellion, a little bit, we don't have to listen. It's kind of, even though they were, at this point, were they thinking like, we're going to become independent? I don't think that was their thought at all. They're just kind of being ornery, but the more they dealt with the British, the more the British kind of angered them. All right, other things. Who are some of the kind of key players from Britain's side that were pretty tough on the colonists? King George III. And then there's a prime minister.
Oh, Greenville.
Yes, Grenville.
Grenville.
And then you had like James Townsend. We had the Townsend Acts that come up later. So anyway, there was a lot of bickering. There was a lot of complaining. What eventually happened to the Stamp Act? It was repealed, right. But then in 1767, the British came out and passed what they called the Declaratory Act. And basically it was almost this, it wasn't actually like a tax or anything, but it was just sort of this statement of arrogance saying, who are you, colonists? We own you. And who are you to tell us what to do? We're going to do whatever we want to do. And it was just kind of more like that attitude, I think, that caused tension. Oh, another thing I should mention back with the French and Indian War, who obviously was fighting along the British soldiers. The colonists were, including like George Washington and some pretty big names. And while that was going on, what was the feeling that the colonists received from the British in terms of what they thought of the colonists?
You're less than us.
Yeah, they thought they were definitely below them. There was kind of this arrogance. They didn't listen to them. They tried to kind of even make suggestions. Well, this is probably the best way to fight it. Like, colonists, who are you? They saw them as being very not distinguished. They saw them being unsophisticated, kind of these mountain men. Not a lot of respect for who they were, and that obviously caused some tension as well. Okay, other things we have. We think we talked about this just briefly. There's this John Dickinson. He wrote this thing called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. There's kind of these like random little things that came out, like Common Sense came in 1776. Basically just people kind of articulating and writing down the feelings. And I think what happened a lot of times, they would write these letters, not just their own personal views, but they sort of write these letters as sort of a view of the people in their area. And then, because a lot of people at that time probably couldn't read or write, so they kind of became the spokesperson for them. 1770. In the meanwhile, what's a problem that the rebels have as far as drumming up support for the cause?
They're all separate.
Yeah, they're all separate. I mean, most of the country was rural. There was a lot of little villages. So they had to do things to make a big splash to get really people's attention. So in 1770, there was really a pretty minor skirmish in Boston. 5 people are killed. But what's the name they gave to that? The Boston Massacre. And that wasn't an accident they gave the name massacre. I think a massacre, think of hundreds of people dying. But again, it was kind of a way to for people to go like, whoa, what's going on here? All right, another thing that happens that causes a lot of tension. 1773, the Tea Act is passed. And basically, why was the Tea Act passed? A couple things. It was probably to generate money. But what else did it do? It's supposed to save what company from bankruptcy? Yeah, Dutch East India Company. And along with that, let's see, we have Thomas Hutchinson. He goes kind of hardcore against the colonists as well. And basically what happens? Taken off? All right, and Kelly had to leave too, obviously.
She has to go to West LA.
West LA?
Get stuff from.
What?
What kind of stuff?
Make sure you don't
Oh, wow.
Can't tell you.
Yes, you can.
Oh, for.
for
okay.
decorations.
Let's do that.
Okay. Anyway.
Right here earlier. Anyway, obviously, what's the kind of the climax of the colonists protesting this?
The Boston Tea Party.
Boston Tea Party,
Wait,
right?
who's Tom Hutchinson?
Yeah.
He was the royal governor in Massachusetts, and he was going really hardcore on the people in Boston. And some places, they still kind of ignored the rule in other areas, but Boston, they were being super, super strict. And Tom Hutchinson. So again, it was kind of, it depended who the leadership was.